So if you're going to decarbonise buildings, and especially buildings in cities, if you don't do it with district heating, what is the alternative to do that? Far more people have succeeded at putting pipes in the street than they have at retrofitting every single building in a city with an alternative low carbon solution.
This is The Energy Canvas, bringing energy solutions to life, with your host, Celtic Dynamics CEO, Dylan Walsh.
Hey, today we're looking at a part of the energy system that doesn't get talked about as much in Ireland, but plays a huge role across Europe, district heating. As we look at decarbonising heat, improving energy security and managing costs, how we heat our buildings is becoming a much bigger focus. Joining me is David Connolly, CEO of HeatGrid Ireland, working on developing low-carbon district heating networks across the country. We'll talk about what district heating actually is, how it works in practice, and what role it could play in Ireland's energy future. David, you're very welcome. So maybe to start us off, anyone who's not familiar, David, what is district heating?
District heating is a way to heat buildings, mainly buildings in cities and towns. In many parts of Europe, towns with as few people as maybe 5,000 or 10,000 people upwards use district heating. So most people think of district heating, they think of large cities, the Berlins, the Copenhagens, the Stockholms, and that's where it's probably best known, but it even gets used down to cities and towns in the range of maybe 5,000 people upwards. And the main reason it's so topical, not so much in Ireland, but certainly in other parts of Europe, is it's a way to heat buildings much easier with renewable energy than with other forms of heating like gas boilers or oil boilers, which are much more difficult to replace with forms of renewable energy than with district heating.
How does it work? You mentioned there renewable technologies. Are we talking heat pumps? What are we talking?
The way it works is it takes what you do in your home in terms of how you heat your building, and it centralizes it into a supersized heating system. So in your home, you have a boiler that takes in some fuel, and then that fuel gets burned and you produce water at maybe 60 or 70 degrees to heat your taps and hot water. But imagine instead of having the boiler in your home, you had your heat source supplying an entire city rather than just a single building. So instead of supplying heat to just one building with one heating system, what district heating does is it creates a supersized heat production system. Let's say nowadays it's not usually boilers, but in the past, instead of having one boiler to heat one house, you had one boiler to heat thousands of homes. So all you're doing is you're scaling up what ultimately works the exact same way as it does at a home level, but in a very, very large scale. And because you've scaled it up, so if you imagine now you have a boiler heating an entire city, it's much easier to replace that boiler with a renewable energy source at one location to supply all the homes than it is to go around and replace individual boilers in every single home. And that's what makes district heating now very attractive in many other countries, is that people are managing to decarbonize their heating stock very cost effectively with district heating, as opposed to trying to do it at an individual building by building level. So it's heating at a large scale.
And I suppose like in Europe, a lot of places would have adopted it a long time ago, even with boilers and stuff. Why do you think it's been widely adopted around mainland Europe and now Ireland, are only doing it on a small scale?
There's about 70 to 80 million people in Europe that use district heating. So just to give people a sense of just how widespread it is. So, you're talking something in the region of about 20% of Europe's population use district heating every day to heat their buildings. And the magic of district heating, when it really starts to come to the front of the queue, is if you imagine you now have a citywide heating system using a single boiler. What they figured out in Europe back in the oil crisis in the 1970s, and it very much started in Denmark as kind of the epicenter for this, was actually instead of using a boiler to heat this city, we actually have some heat being thrown away by our power stations into the rivers and seas all around the country. We actually have some industrial processes here that have heat that's being thrown away that they're not using. Why don't we start using that heat that's being thrown away right now to heat the cities rather than using a boiler, for example? So in other words, we're effectively getting, if you want to call it, free heat that's currently being thrown away. And that then started this, let's call it, heat recovery evolution with district heating at its heart, where you originally had boilers heating these large citywide heating systems, but it was very much driven by an energy security thing, not too different to what we're going through right now with the oil crisis and the crisis we had a few years ago with the gas crisis, that in that 1960s, 70s era, when fuel became very scarce, they had to come up with new ideas as to how to save energy. And one of the very effective ways was to say, actually, let's turn off these boilers that are heating our cities and instead use the heat we're throwing away. And that's what sparked, I'd imagine, a huge growth of district heating across a lot of parts of Europe, was this idea that we could have better use of our energy, reduce our exposure to importing fossil fuels from all around the world. And as time went by through the 70s and 80s, that narrative evolved probably to add in the climate change agenda with it. Now you weren't just solving energy security and using your energy more efficiently. You were now using low carbon energy as well, where instead of just using waste heat that was being thrown away by others, they started to produce like biomass boilers, large heat pumps centrally. That all started around the 80s in different parts of Europe. And I suppose that then is where Ireland's focus on district heating has been in the last 2 or 3 years, as it started to come onto the policy landscape, is how do we use district heating to help across those various fronts: decarbonisation, energy security, more stable heat prices for people's homes.
If we take it in the context of someone in Ireland's listening, then where should we be considering district heating now, like in the current context? Where is it getting adopted more for Ireland?
The more densely populated somewhere is, typically the easier district heating is to build. So in other words, the easiest places usually start with the cities and work your way down as towns get smaller. And you could probably apply that threshold of anything less than 5 or 10,000 people is probably very tricky. Certainly in the early days, it's tricky. Then the other thing, though, that's an important maybe just lever in the whole thing is, one side of it is how densely populated your area is, so you can connect them with a single pipe. And then the other side is the availability of those free heat sources that I talked about. Like if you have a town that's quite small, sitting right beside somewhere that's throwing away lots of heat, now the sound doesn't need to be as densely populated to make district heating cost effective, because you're effectively getting a very low cost heat source if it's currently being thrown away. And there's lots of places all around Ireland that heat is being thrown away. That's probably one of those things that not many people see it because it doesn't get quantified very often. There was a study done by the Irish District Energy Association back in 2018 that concluded there was more heat being thrown away in Ireland than was needed to heat all of the buildings in the whole country, just to give you an idea of the magnitude. So densely populated areas in terms of the demand side, and free heat sources in terms of heat being thrown away on the other side. And it's a jigsaw between those two things that usually defines how attractive district heating is for a certain area. But let's say start with bigger cities is usually a good rule of thumb, and work your way down to the smaller towns over time.
Yeah, and I suppose you kind of touched on this about energy security. Like, I suppose that's the hot topic at the moment with everything that's going on in Iran and stuff. How do you see district heating helping on the energy security side? I'd imagine it helps directly with prices.
It is extremely helpful, but you have to plan in advance, because building infrastructure takes years and decades, not months and days. So in the 2022 gas crisis, while we were handing out energy credits to every home in the country, the price of district heating in Denmark remained almost completely flat. So they had almost no increase in their heating costs, because they had prepared for the previous 2 decades by putting in the pipes in the ground to connect these local renewable and waste heat sources to their buildings. So while we're importing oil and gas and watching these fuel shortages come right to our front door in a matter of days and weeks when the crises kick off, they don't rely on any of these imports, because they're using these local heat sources that are in their own control, within their own boundaries to manage, that they're not depending on others to provide them with. So whenever there's a global shortage or crisis, they don't feel this land right on their fuel prices, because they don't use oil or gas to heat their homes any longer. They use the likes of district heating in the towns and cities, where you can, let's say, manage the prices and the supply of these things independently. And so that lands right back to your bill. And there's a bit of a vicious cycle here, where instead of spending €1 billion on subsidies and credits during every crisis, if you had spent that €1 billion building this infrastructure in advance, you wouldn't need these credits to reduce people's bills, because they wouldn't feel the burden of these exposures if you had that. That's what the whole role of district heating is to try and put that infrastructure in place in advance of the next crisis, so you don't end up having to pay for these subsidies and credits to sort out short-term pain.
Let's say I'm a customer or a business owner or a consumer at the moment. Let's say they have a new development, because really district heating new developments is easier to implement probably. How much do you think it would affect their energy costs if they had a district heating loop instead of being, let's say, straight boilers or something like that?
Yeah, so the question is probably very dependent on what time that actually would happen. So let's say in Ireland today, where there's no, what I would call citywide district heating. So what you're talking about with a new development is maybe like an apartment complex or a housing estate that's coming, that is not really district. It's what we would call communal, which is like the end of the pipe. If you think of a city network, a Dublin equivalent in Europe might have 2,000-3,000 kilometres of district heating pipe in the ground to bring the hot water all around the city. A Galway, Limerick, Waterford might have 300-400 kilometres of pipe work in the ground. That last few hundred metres to connect an apartment complex is just the bit on the end. But in Ireland, that bit on the end is certainly a great place for new developments to start, because if they build that little bit on the end, it makes it easier for people to connect a district heating system whenever one comes down the road. If you were to put a district heating, let's say ready, let's call it that, or a communal system in place, like typically for a large development, it shouldn't have any increase in your running costs. It probably would be in and around the same. But if a wider district heating system then comes down the road, you'd have the potential to significantly reduce those costs. And the reason for that is that if you build a smaller scheme that's just serving one housing estate or is just serving one apartment block, you're very unlikely to be able to plug that into a waste heat source or something that's throwing heat away, because that's probably in another part of the city. But when the wider district heating system comes, that's when you get access to them benefits of being linked into a waste heat source, if that makes sense. But the key thing for a new development is that if you don't build that piece on the end and have it ready for a district heating connection down the road, you'll never be able to get that benefit, even when a pipe comes past your door, if you haven't prepared to be able to connect into it.
Yeah, so then I suppose we're talking, like, advantage-wise, we're talking big waste heating systems from, like, power plants, like big factories with big heat sources, stuff like that, yeah? Are we getting many in Ireland that are taking that up? I can see it as a complexity with more stakeholders involved, for a business owner.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. For the customers at the end, they don't know anything about what happens beyond the connection to their network. So like take the electricity grid as a really good example. How many people know that we have gone from 0 to 40% wind power over the last 20 years behind our plug? Probably no one has noticed any difference. It's just electricity still coming through their plug, the same way as electricity used to come through the plug 20 years ago. It still comes through the plug. And I think if you asked many people, when I lived abroad, I lived in Copenhagen for 6 years. I don't think any of my friends that were not working in the energy business had any idea what was happening as the district heating network was decarbonising over the last 20 years. All they did was they just continued to buy heat from the network and didn't really know anything about what was happening past their plug, if you want to call it that, as where they bought the heat. In Ireland, it's probably no harm just to give people a bit of context. In Ireland, there's effectively zero district heating today. There's only one scheme in Tala, which is about 2 kilometres long. So it's very much a pilot of what can be done. It takes waste heat from a data centre and it supplies that heat to 2 buildings, a university campus and the council's offices locally. That's the only one that exists in Ireland as a pure, let's call it what people would typically refer to as a district heating system. And even in the context of district, that would be extremely small. Again, Copenhagen, same size as Dublin, maybe 3,000 kilometres of pipework, Dublin, 2 kilometres of pipework. So it's almost at the equivalent of zero in Ireland as to what we have. The projects in Ireland that exist are all at early stage development. They're all at identifying where could they set up the first energy centres and the first customers that could get connected. And that just is probably a signal of how far we have to go, And you asked me earlier, why do I think that, other countries have done this and Ireland hasn't? I think when I was given that picture of the energy security problem and the way to solve decarbonisation, while other countries went down this road of district heating, I think in Ireland we went down the road of natural gas for our towns and cities as the heat source. So that's, I would imagine, very heavily linked to the fact that we found a gas field in Kinsale in the 70s. Again, that's just my own assumption that we found the gas fields, probably meant that we had our own resources of natural gas. And then we started to roll out natural gas in our towns and cities. Other places across Europe decided to use district heating as their way to heat their towns and cities. We don't have much in Ireland today. And I suppose that's where, when we try to look for solutions for our energy security problems, our decarbonisation problems, the only bit of silver lining is there's a huge opportunity there to use existing technology that's been used and proven everywhere else to make a big difference if we can implement it.
Yeah. And I suppose then if we look further afield, like you've got the likes of Sweden and Norway using geothermal, you've got France using a lot of nuclear and then looping them into district heating loops for cooling and stuff like that. But we're talking heat pumps in Ireland realistically at the moment, are we? We're not talking waste heat and heat pumps is what we're talking at the moment, is it?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that'll be like in a world where Ireland starts from effectively ground zero and tries to build district heating over the next 10, 20 years, because we're starting in an environment where we'll want it to be decarbonised from day one, as opposed to other countries that probably started with fossil fuels as the source and decarbonised over time. I think that's very likely a good sense of what the mix will be. I think it'll be electrified solutions because we've so much indigenous wind and solar now coming. So we have a lot of electricity in Ireland that's produced locally. So I think a lot of electrification solutions, which I think will be predominantly heat pumps. And then excess heat, as you say. So heat coming from power stations, industry, data centres, wastewater treatment plants, all of those could be used and have been used in many other countries to supply district heating networks. Always depends on what your local city or town has usually, rather than something that is defined at a national level. Like it always typically comes down to, is there a power station sitting on the edge of the city? Right, perfect. That could be used as a heat source. Is there a data center sitting in the middle of the city? Is there an industrial plant that's using something that means they have some waste heat? Is there a wastewater treatment plant nearby that could be used as a heat source? It usually typically, rather than it coming down to let's say a nationally driven thing, it usually comes down to, for whatever local town or city is available as a heat source locally, that's what is often the preference. But I think a mix of heat pumps and waste heat sources, I'd say, will definitely shape the Irish district heating landscape for the years ahead. I think wood chip could also help.
Wood chip. Yeah.
We have a pretty significant forest resource in Ireland as well. So that's just something that in Sweden, for example, where they have a lot of forestry, sustainably grown wood chip has been really deployed at scale in district heating systems as well.
Let's think about it from a business owner's perspective in a moment. District heating systems have many stakeholders typically, and they kind of see them as complex to manage. From what you're saying earlier then, the way it typically works is the factories and stuff, or the waste heat providers, will have one step. Then there's the grid, let's say, for district heat. And then the consumer, they're not aware of what's going on in the back end. So I suppose the stakeholders drop then quite significantly for people that have to deal with each other. Yeah?
Yeah, usually there's a stakeholder in the middle that brings all the jigsaw together. So usually there's the person with the waste heat. All they do is they engage with effectively the district heating utility for that town or city. So there's, let's call it, unlike gas and electricity, there's I've never seen a national utility for district heating. So there isn't like an Ireland's district heating utility that I've seen in any other countries. Usually there's a local company or a council or somebody that sets up it can be privately owned, it can be publicly owned, it can vary from town to town, city to city. But let's say somebody sets up Town District Heating Limited in the local area. So in HeatGrid, for example, we have a project in Galway we're working on. We're developing a low carbon district heating system in Galway City. So we have HeatGrid Galway set up as an entity. We then engage with people that could be potential customers. We engage with people who could be potential heat sources. We engage with the local authority around where we could put pipes to connect each of those with one another. We engage with local landowners to see, can we secure a site for our energy centre to build the place that we're going to produce our heat? And each of those stakeholders doesn't really worry about how the whole jigsaw is fitting together. They just worry about the single conversation they have with us. So when we approach, let's say, a customer, the customer is really concerned about how much will it cost me? and will it decarbonize my building? That's usually the two most common conversations we would have, because people are really keen to meet certain targets usually for decarbonization as a customer. As the customer, they don't have to worry about, well, how is HeatGrid going to build the pipes in the street? That's a HeatGrid problem to resolve, you could say. So for a business owner or a homeowner or a large public sector building, the conversation is usually as simple as, how much will I pay for the heat? How will you connect me to it? And what kind of provisions do I want to ensure will happen? Like, for example, that it's decarbonized heat when you supply it to me. If you flip it the other side and we're dealing with, let's say, a data center or an industrial facility that has waste heat, then they're just talking to us about, okay, what temperature can we supply it at? What price will we get paid when we sell it to you? How will you connect to our facility? Great. That's the way we'll work that. But there's somebody like a HeatGrid that sits in the middle, whose whole world and job it is to try and bring the stakeholders and mix of people together to make it work.
Okay, so let's say, at the moment you're trying to do one in Galway. What kind of heat sources are we pulling from? Is it excess heat from, well, you said data centers is one anyway. Is there...
Well, the one in Galway is an air source heat pump because we couldn't find a heat source close enough to the initial customers. So there is a couple of waste heat sources, I think, in Galway that may become viable as the network grows. But because of the distance between those and the, let's say, initial customers that we're trying to attract to that project, we used an air source heat pump. And that's usually your, let's say, base case for a project of air is accessible to everyone. So you can always design a project around using the air as your source of heat. So we've built the Galway project around an air source heat pump solution.
You mentioned decarbonisation there, and I suppose that's a focus topic, particularly coming up to 2030 for a lot of people. How, in real terms, district heating helps towards decarbonising?
So I suppose the very simple answer is that there is citywide district heating networks across Europe that are pretty much zero to very low carbon. Like, you're talking maybe if the emissions equivalent of a gas boiler is about 250 grams of CO2 for every kilowatt hour of heat it produces, there are loads of district heating systems that are less than 10 or 20 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So, how effective is it? It can literally give you zero carbon heat at scale for hundreds of thousands of people. And that has been done for 20, 30 years. The tricky part is, how do you get it built from scratch? So how do you get the pipes in the ground? How do you get the land for the first energy centre in a city? How do you build the first energy production facility? That just takes time, as any infrastructure project takes time, and that takes money and cost to try and get it set up. So you have that, how effective is it at decarbonisation? Extremely effective once it's built, but it's very difficult to get it built because it is an infrastructure project. And hence it takes, a number of years to build it. It doesn't take days or weeks to build it. It takes, typically a greenfield project will take 4 to 5 years to go from maybe first concept to operation. That's the kind of time frame you're talking about. So with 2030 on the horizon, there's the first government supports for district heating are due to be announced this year. They are literally, in the world of district heating, into the home straight of what could be done by 2030. It'll take any projects mobilising now will take at least the 3, 4, 5 years to be go live to be able to have an impact for 2030.
And I suppose these are all cross different borders between people and everything. So you've got the complexities of planning and everything coming into it and everything.
I would say in Ireland, the perception of all of that challenge is very well understood. I would say, I think most people understand in Ireland the challenges of what come with getting planning permission for a project, dealing with multiple stakeholders, putting pipework in the ground. And it's true, it is all very challenging and none of it is easy. But I think what is sometimes underestimated in the Irish conversation is how challenging the alternative is compared to that. So if you're going to decarbonise buildings, and especially buildings in cities, if you don't do it with district heating, what is the alternative to do that? And usually the alternative to do that, and certainly in an Irish context, what everyone talks about as the alternative is we're going to retrofit buildings and replace our oil and gas boilers with individual heat pumps in every single home. Now, when you put those two things side by side, I think history has shown us, and the evidence has shown us, that as challenging as it is to put a pipe in the street, trying to take 20, 30, 40,000 buildings, coordinate with every single individual homeowner, retrofit how the building fabric is currently done with something else, and then individually go in and make each of those buildings heat pump ready and put a heat pump into it, and then upgrade the electrical infrastructure to be able to manage every single building having an individual heat pump. I have never seen any city achieve that. And I think in Ireland, that challenge is sometimes underestimated. I think in a countryside, I think it's much easier to do that because you have more space, you have not as much congestion of electrical supply. But in a city context, that is immensely challenging. And when you put those two things side by side, as challenging as district heating is, I would argue, and I would say history has shown us, far more people have succeeded at putting pipes in the street than they have at retrofitting every single building in a city with an alternative low carbon solution. I haven't seen that succeed to date. So yeah, it is a challenge. There is absolutely no doubt about it, but it is a challenge which in many other places has been overcome and successfully delivered. And I think that's what I often see as missing in the Irish narrative around how we decarbonise our urban areas. Is I'm not sure there's that like for like often put up against one another to demonstrate how, as challenging as it is, I would still argue it's the easiest way to decarbonise and give our urban buildings a secure supply of heat.
What do you think is the biggest barrier then for getting accelerated, essentially?
It's money. When you're trying to provide people with low carbon heat and you have to build all of the infrastructure from scratch, you cannot give people who are the first customers a cost-effective supply compared to buying natural gas today. So gas is much cheaper than what you could offer as a price for the first customers, because when you do your first customer, you have to build the very first piece of pipework, you have to build the very first energy centre facility, and you have to build usually the network has to be long enough to connect the larger customers in a city day one, who can often be a bit further away from each other. And when you take all of the costs of doing that against what somebody could do in terms of just continuing buying gas from a grid that was built 30, 40 years ago and has all been paid, and outside of these energy crises that we get, usually is very cheap to buy, it's very hard to convince people to connect to a district heating system when the cost is going to be significantly more. So in other countries, what they've done is they've offered grant supports in the same way that Ireland offers grant supports for people to put a heat pump in their home. Governments in other countries have offered grant supports for the likes of companies like HeatGrid Ireland, who are trying to build the first phase of a project in a city, so that can offset the price of building the first phase and make it more commercially and financially viable for the first customers to connect. And then once you have the first customers connected, usually then district heating can offer a competitive price to the people that connect on later, because you've built the first spine network, you've got people that you've passed all the way along the road on your first customers that you've connected, so you can what we call densify the network. But the hurdle at the beginning is, how do you give the first 5 or 10 large customers that are going to connect a price for their heat that they can afford, when you have to try and include the cost of building all the infrastructure for the first time at the beginning? And that's the big hurdle. And once you're up and running, district heating can get kind of mobilized itself pretty well, but it's that initial hurdle that's the huge barrier.
At the moment in Ireland, we have the SSRH is sort of the incentive for people to do biomass, people to do heat pumps. You probably need something like that at a bigger scale. Exactly.
And that's, I don't know if you may have seen in the Oireachtas about a week or two ago, the minister announced that there's going to be the SSDH coming, which is the support scheme for district heating, which is effectively a larger version of the SSRH designed for district heating systems, because SSRH is limited on the heat pump side to a max of about €1 million. And there is no district heating scheme I've ever seen that could ever would ever be going very far with €1 million. That is not the kind of scale of these projects. These would be much more akin. My previous role and life would have been in developing part of the wind industry, of working in that development of wind farms. It'd be much more akin to that scale of a project that you're trying to get off the ground with these.
If Ireland gets it right, how could in 10 years the heating systems look like for us?
They are immensely better as an end customer. And I can tell you that as someone that lived as a customer on one of them for 6 years. So I can give you a few funny stories on that front, which is, imagine a world where heat was very like the way you use electricity. You turn on a switch, you get electricity. In the world of district heating, you turn on a tap, you get hot water, you turn on your radiators, they heat up. You have no idea how they're heating up. You don't have to worry about managing a boiler or a heat pump. You don't know what's happening past the wall in your home or building. You just simply use it when you need it and you turn it off when you don't. And then you pay a bill at the end of the month based on whatever it is that you used. Like, I had friends come over once from Denmark to Ireland, and I had just had a shower, and the Danish friend wanted to have a shower. And I said, actually, you have to hold on there 10 or 15 minutes. I have to turn on the immersion to heat up the hot water because the hot water's run out. And he looked at me and he meant, the hot water has run out? How do you mean the hot water has run out? Because he had never lived in a world where the hot water doesn't come through the tap. It'd be like someone turning to an Irish person and saying, the electricity has run out. We have to wait for 10 minutes for it to recharge again. That's the, I know it sounds weird and different, but when you've never seen anything different, and that's the way that I would have lived for 6 years while I was on the end of it, you think it's just normal that you turn on a tap and hot water comes through it from somewhere. You don't really think about where it comes from. You just take it, and that's it. As a user experience, you've nothing to manage in your building anymore. You just use it when you need it, and you pay a bill at the end of the month based on whatever it is you use. So it's a very pleasant user experience once you have it.
Yeah. And I suppose the analogy there where you're on about the immersions and we have to turn it on and wait, like on the electric side, that's the equivalent of like your grid going down and you're powering it back up with a generator, similar to what the likes of Lebanon and Tunisia will do and stuff like that. You'd be waiting 10, 15 minutes for it to back up. Like,
yeah. And I think that probably reflects the expression on his face when he asked me the question and I gave him the answer. He was kind of probably wondering, what on earth way do you live here? As in, how do you mean you have to wait for this hot water to heat up? And again, it's just in that world, as I say, Copenhagen is very similar size to Dublin, not a huge amount different in terms of climate either, but they've grown up in a world there where anytime they needed hot water, they just turn on a tap, water comes out, they turn on their rads, heat comes through it. I'm not sure many of my friends outside of my energy industry friends when I lived there would have any idea really what is happening outside of that. Mm-hmm. It's just, it comes out of the wall. That's kind of it.
Just to wrap up then, what we like to do at the end of every podcast is our previous guest has left you a question, but if you would like to ask industry any questions, so anyone in the energy or periphery to energy space, is there any question you'd like an answer to?
How do we make sure that the low carbon, energy secure alternative is also the most cost effective for end consumers to do? If we could make the most cost effective thing for people to do also be what's the best for the climate and energy security, I think a lot of things would just happen automatically. But right now, it's usually cheaper to burn fossil fuels that we import from all around the world than it is to use renewable energy or other things that we would be able to manage ourselves.
That's a good question. Okay, and I'll read out the one they left for you. So what is the main barrier in permitting for the energy industry? How do we actually start to fix it?
In permitting, so in trying to get planning permission?
Yeah, so this is big energy storage and renewable. That's who it's coming from.
I'd say the biggest challenge is just the time it takes. So there's different answers here for different sectors, but like in my previous life, when we were looking at wind farms, like you might be 2 to 4 years minimum in advance of even submitting a planning application, getting it ready. And then you could be caught up for years in a planning application process with delays that often can be very questionable as to how genuine the concerns can even have been that raised. When they're genuine, they're brilliant. That's perfect. That's the planning system working. But where there's often delays when you'd wonder how genuine it is, that's where the time that can be dragged on if they're not genuine is immense. That can take years. So I think the biggest challenge with planning is not necessarily all the things you have to do. It's just the time it takes for both doing it and going through the process of it. So I think any way to try and make those timelines shorter would significantly help infrastructure to develop easier.
Mhm.
Like that doesn't necessarily have to be that people do less or something. It might just be that people can go through those processes quicker than what they currently can today. I think the time it takes to prepare and get through can obviously be a huge challenge for infrastructure projects and often be the result of many projects, dare I say, giving up / failing because they can't continue to, keep spending money on a project that isn't able to show progress over a long period of time.
So that's the end, David. Thanks so much for joining us. They were really, really interesting insights. And thanks again for joining the Energy Canvas.
No problem. Really appreciate you having me. Thanks for having me on.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you get the next episode automatically. Also, please do share with a friend who you think would find it interesting. Just tell them to search for The Energy Canvas with Celtic Dynamics on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by CelticDynamics.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.